Welcome to the second of our AVERT Symposium post-conference webinar series. For those of us who weren't able to attend the first one of these with the wonderful Dr. Maura Conway, who gave a really terrific talk on what was happening in the area of far right and radical right extremism. This series, of which this is the second, which comes in 4 parts, really arose after the very successful AVERT International Symposium last November, and a number of people were interested, particularly in government, were interested in being able to have a deeper dive into a number of the topics that were covered in the conference. As we know, conference papers, 20 minutes, there is always a limit to the depth and the nuance that you're able to explore in those briefer presentations. And so this series is really designed to allow that deeper dive, to allow for a fuller consideration and also a fuller discussion between participants and various speakers on some of the most compelling topics, I think, that both practitioners and researchers are trying to grapple with at the moment in relation to violent extremism. So we are extremely fortunate in having with us today from Ireland, Professor Maura Conway. Maura is going to be talking to us about online extremism and terrorism and what to watch for in 2022. So online violent extremism and online extremism more broadly, not moving at a glacial speed by any stretch of the imagination, resembling a cheetah more than a glacier, and constantly dynamic, constantly evolving. So Maura is going to be reviewing VOX-Pol's open access report titled Violent Extremism and Terrorism Online, the Year in Review, and delving in particular into some of what's happened over the last year or so and some of the key things that we need to be watching for. So just before I also share with you a little bit about Maura's background, I'm assuming that many of you, if not everybody, is familiar with Maura and her work, but I will share her bio in a minute. But just before I do, a couple of very quick housekeeping things. So Maura will be speaking probably for about 40 to 50 minutes. And after that, we will have plenty of time for Q&A, in which people will have a chance to ask questions, make comments, and really have that sort of engagement. Now, the way that we do that for these webinars, we ask you to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screens. Feel free to post questions using that Q&A tab while Maura is talking, okay? So it's fine if something sparks your interest or you think, oh, I want to know more about that, or gee, I see this a little differently. Feel free to type it in. When Maura's presentation is finished, Lydia Khalil will be moderating the Q&A session, reading those questions out, giving Maura a chance to respond, and we'll take it from there. But we will hold off on dealing with questions until Maura has actually had a chance to finish speaking. So in terms of Maura's background, Dr. Maura Conway is Professor of International Security in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University in Dublin. In Ireland, and she is coordinator of VOX-Pol. Many of us, VOX-Pol was doing innovative work on online extremism before any of us really knew even what online extremism was. So VOX-Pol has really been a terrific major contributor to the field for a long time now. It's an EU-funded project on violent online political extremism. Maura's particular research interests are in the area of terrorism and the internet, including cyber terrorism, the functioning and the effectiveness of violent political extremist online content, and of course, violent online radicalization. She has published well over 40 articles and chapters in her areas of specialization and expertise. expertise. Her work has appeared in, I think, really in all the top journals that you would expect to see them in. She has presented her findings to the United Nations in New York, to the Commission of the European Union in Brussels, the UK House of Lords, and elsewhere. She is also a member of the Academic Advisory Board of Europol's Counterterrorism Center.
Like Michelle said, every year actually in VOX-Pol for the last number of years, we've produced an open access report that looks at online extremism and terrorism over the previous 12 months, basically. And all of those are available on our VOX-Pol website. They've been appearing since 2016. And actually, we first started doing them in order for them to be circulated to representatives of EU member states and other organizations that are a part of the European Union's internet forum. So the EUIF, which was established in 2015, which is basically the EU's flagship body in terms of responses, policy responses, legislative responses to online extremism and terrorism. I'll come back to the EU at the end of towards the end of my remarks. If you're interested, we recently published on our website our most recent report. You can see the blue cover there on the screen for 2021. I'm not really going to get into what I thought were the sort of highlights, if you like, in inverted commas, of online extremism and terrorism in 2021. What I'm actually going to focus on here is a sort of a box, if you like, or a table that appears at the very end of that report, where I point to, you know, some of the things to watch out for in online extremism and terrorism in 2022, or kind of the next 12 months, if you'd like. So I guess one of the things I will say before I start talking about, you know, what to watch for in 2022 is that, you know, the biggest change that has definitely occurred in the online extremism and terrorism scene between 2016, when we first started doing these reports, and now, I would say the most consequential, certainly, change has been the level of disruption, or if you like, deplatforming that has taken place. When we first started doing this work, you know, extremists and terrorists really were still operating fairly unimpeded, even on really major platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. And this included notorious terrorist organizations such as Islamic State, as well as a whole panoply of other extremist and terrorist groups. As I'm sure you're all aware, the scene is really quite distinctly different at the present time, and the major platforms in particular have taken very significant steps around disrupting explicitly terrorism content, but also change their terms of service as regards various types of extremist content also. But what I want to do this evening is I want to talk about what I think are 5 issues sort of worth watching, keeping an eye on in 2022. These are big ticket items, I have to say, number 1. So if people are interested in really much more specific things, we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A. But basically what I'm going to focus on here is 5 big ticket issues. Not all of them are new. Some of them are distinctly old, in fact, and some of them are developing slowly over time. And I guess the other thing I would say about this is that somebody else would probably identify, you know, some other issues as being, you know, sort of the top 5 ones to watch, if you like. And so I'd definitely be interested in hearing from you about your top 5 ones to watch for 2022 in the Q&A. But for me, I'm going to talk about piggybacking real-world events. I'm going to talk about something that's really quite interesting to me personally, which is the resurfacing of old technology that we see right now, increasing exploitation of the DWeb, and what I mean here is the decentralized web, continuing finance related activity, especially around crypto, and fifthly, what is a real let's call it a flowering of initiatives as regards legislation worldwide. And then in my concluding remarks, I'm going to draw your attention to a few sort of longer term things maybe to think about, or stuff that I'm still mulling over. And again, I'd be interested to hear from you on those. Number one, piggybacking on real world events. Like I said, not anything new at all. There is a very long history of online extremists and terrorists, you know, making real world events, large and small, work for them. And this is true of, for example, violent jihadis on the one hand, and the extreme right, say, on the other hand. There are two, obviously, very prominent recent examples where we can see this happening. The first is around COVID-19. When this first emerged as a major issue around March of 2020, both jihadis, including so-called Islamic State, and also the whole swathe of the extreme right, began to use this for their purposes. Islamic State largely framed COVID as a message from God to the Western world broadly, if you like, to sort of a warning at the very least, and I guess something much more potentially detrimental to the worst, at the worst. An interesting thing happened, though. It wasn't something that really held the attention of the jihadis online over time. So you really begin to see a downturn in attention to COVID and COVID-related matters pretty swiftly from, say, April, May of 2020 onwards. I mean, it doesn't disappear, but it just doesn't maintain their interest to the same extent as it absolutely maintains the interest of extreme right users directly up to the present time. It is COVID-19 and responses to COVID-19, including vaccinations, masking, lockdowns, and all the associated activity has been something that extreme right users have absolutely utilized to their advantage. But the other thing that has emerged even more recently, and that has also sparked extreme right online activity, is the war in Ukraine. I would say that responses amongst the extreme right to the war in Ukraine are more diverse. They're not so lockstep, if you like, in their response to that as they are to COVID-19 and related events. Interestingly, the jihadis also have had online activity around Ukraine. Again, it's very broadly about the decline of the West and this kind of thing. But again, it's not so attractive to jihadi online users in terms of piggybacking as it is to extreme right users. I would say one more thing about real world events and how this is they're playing out online in terms of extremism and terrorism, and that is that mis and disinformation play very crucial roles here too, and they've always done so. So I mean, a lot of the activity, if we use the extreme right example that they've engaged in over decades now online involves taking some event that has actually occurred, oftentimes very hyperlocal events, and building a narrative or a story around them that has both true factual elements, but also bad information that they inject into these narratives intentionally. And so one of the areas I think that we're beginning to see research work around, but I think that we could do more around, is precisely the interplays of online extremism and terrorism on the one hand, and online mis and disinformation on the other hand. And I think there's a very wide range of issues or angles that are worth exploring there. We can always come back to that in the Q&A if people are interested. Like I said, number two is something that I'm quite interested in at the present time, and that's what I call the resurfacing of old technology. And this goes to something I've already said that's been very important in this space over the last 5 years or more. And that is the very widespread takedowns that have been undertaken by, in particular, major social media companies of online extremist and terrorist content, and also accounts. And this has caused at least two quite significant things to happen. One is, I would say, a shift back, if you like, to old technologies, and the other is a shift forward, if you will, to very new technologies. So they're exploring both the past and the future, if you like, in this new context that they find themselves in, where they're no longer so free to act, especially on major social media platforms. And the kind of old technologies that I'm talking about here are things like audio, which in the extreme right goes back really a very long time to the early 1980s with the use of bulletin board systems. But now you see activity in Clubhouse, in Spotify, on Twitter, audio, etc. Also, email is new again, especially email newsletters, both email newsletter services, like, for example, Substack, which is going to be an interesting company to watch because they've sort of taken up this banner of free speech, including in quite recent blog posts and tweets by their management, for example. But the other thing about email is that you don't need to use a service like Substack. You can use your own email infrastructure if you like, for whatever purposes you wish. And so for that reason, email is likely to have some significant utility for extremists and terrorists. And then the one that I'm most interested in at the present time is websites. Audio and email, they are, like I say, they're hot again, if you will, generally. So that's why, Twitter, for example, has introduced audio. That's why Substack has emerged as a significant, in inverted commas, new company online. And it's basically because, and why they're attractive to extremists and terrorists is, like for other people, this content, audio content, email content, it's really easy to produce. But for extremists and terrorists, it's also much less moderated than text, for example, or video or other types of content that we see online. The websites are interesting, I think, because they never really went away. I guess that's the first point to make. So websites have always had some role to play in online extremism and terrorism. They were some of the very first spaces in which this kind of activity took place. Sure, over time, you see a pretty significant decline in their use because you see the shift to social media. but they never disappeared. And they can be very useful for a wide variety of purposes. Right now, for example, there are multiple Islamic State fan sites and other violent jihadi websites that are used as archives of IS content, for example, that used to be really easily available on social media, but no longer is. And the thing about websites and what makes them attractive for these purposes is that you have much greater control by the user. They are also really quite difficult to get taken down, because oftentimes it's unclear, you know, at the back end, who to contact and who to you know, make aware of this website activity, and thereby to interfere with the website, the website's continued operation online. And even when they are taken down, and definitely websites are being taken down at the present time, but even when they are being taken down, it's relatively easy for them to pop up again somewhere else. So for that reason, they really are seeing an uptick in popularity again. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that one too in the Q&A if people are interested. My overall point is that basically what was old is new again in online extremism and terrorism, largely due to the pressure that's been put on this kind of activity by major social media platforms in the last number of years. Relatedly too, so I said that's the sort of backward view, right? So the online extremists and terrorists were casting around, and some of them have gone for sort of old technologies, but some people took a more forward looking view, and you do see increasing expansion of the so-called DWeb. And basically, this terminology of DWeb is used to refer to the federated or the decentralized web, not the dark web, which is a different beast. In other words, the DWeb has no central control. It's largely user-operated services, servers, and what have you. And there are new companies emerging all the time that make it easier and easier to set up these servers and be connected and what have you. I'll give you two examples. ISIS, in fact, so-called Islamic State, has been actually a user of Rocket Chat, which is a DWeb, a decentralized web service, since the establishment of Rocket Chat back in, don't quote me on this, but maybe 2015 or so. And what Rocket Chat is, it's quite similar to services like Slack or Trello or something like that, right? So sort of office management or what would you call it, production management sort of activity. But they use it for communicating, for releasing content, circulating content, all this kind of thing. Gab's reliance on Mastodon is also something that grabbed attention when it happened some years ago now. So Gab is what most people agree is an extreme right social media platform. It looks a little bit like Twitter, but it uses for its back-end infrastructure Mastodon, which is a decentralized or federated web service. And actually, Gab, very quickly having turned to this service, became the largest node on Mastodon, which didn't make a lot of people on Mastodon happy, but there was not a whole lot they thought they could do about it. And so this is one of the reasons that policymakers and others are concerned about negative externalities, if you like, of the major clampdowns, the deplatforming that has taken place over the last number of years. So it pushes these actors to explore the use of other online spaces. And an obvious place to go is to the decentralized web, which really is much freer than corporate online spaces like Facebook, Twitter, and what have you. And there was the feeling that the decentralized web would, be very, very difficult to deal with. And when Gab became the most prominent node on Mastodon, Mastodon released a blog post which basically said, we didn't want this to happen, but there's not much we can do about it. That was a number of years ago now, but interesting, they've plainly been reflecting on this issue. And so in March of 2021, what I want to say is not Mastodon per se, but, operators of decentralized web services have plainly been reflecting on this issue. And in March of 2021, Rocket Chat, because an actual terrorist organization is really quite heavily reliant on their services, they announced actually an internal task force to tip off law enforcement and other authorities to illegal use of its open source code. And I think that's definitely one to watch, simply because there's no question going forward that the decentralized web is growing generally. So it's increasing its users, it's becoming more easily accessible for ordinary users in inverted commas. And so we will see more of a shift to the decentralized web by bad actors going forward. And this is, like I say, an innovation to watch in terms of Rocket Chat's task force, and also whether other decentralized web service providers will begin to go in similar types of directions. Number 4 point I wanted to make was around financing. Now, plainly, online terrorism activity and online extremist activity in relation to financing is very long-standing. So almost from the very no, not almost, literally from the very establishment of the World Wide Web, but actually even prior to that with bulletin board systems and what have you, back in the early 80s, you get extremists and terrorists using these systems in order to raise funds. So the raising of funds is not in itself something new. But I think there are two issues at least two issues that are worth paying attention to in this realm at the present time. And none of these are precisely new either, but I do think they are sort of gaining in momentum right now. And the first is the business, if you like, of extremism. There is a lot of activity by extreme right users still online, including on some major social media platforms, but also on more minor platforms and messaging applications and in gaming and other spaces, for example. One of the things I would point to is sort of what you might call micro celebrity and influencer marketing. For example, a guy called Tim Giannett was on DWeb. He's a well-known figure in the online extreme right, and he was on DWeb live on the 6th of January 2021. So in other words, he was taking part in the assault on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And he streamed live for a goodly portion of those events. and he actually made a couple of $1,000 on that day from contributions that were made by viewers. And he certainly wasn't the only person who made money on that occasion. A bunch of what we might call, like I say, sort of micro extreme right celebrities or influencers were there. And so were actually a bunch of more sort of quotidian extreme right individuals. And so quite a lot of people streamed live, and a subset of those made small and some quite large amounts, like I say, of money on that occasion. An interesting thing did happen. A lot of the services actually took steps to ensure that that money wasn't transferred to those activists on that occasion. And that's everybody from PayPal, 2D Live, for example, and others. But there certainly is a financing, a profit making aspect to quite a large amount of online extreme right activity. It's much less so for violent jihadis, for example, and this has to do with a bunch of issues, but one of them is certainly having to do with legislation around financing terrorism. So if, for example, you shifted even a very small amount of money, as I'm sure you're all aware, to ISIS, you could find yourself in very considerable trouble. But this is much less the case. There are many, many fewer extreme right organizations designated as terrorist organizations. And so many, many people associated with the extreme right are absolutely free to act online and in other spaces, of course. So that's one thing, that the business of extremism, if you like, and its online components. The second aspect is around cryptocurrency transactions, and these are indeed increasing. Now, we've pointed in our reports to the cryptocurrency issue a couple of different times in the past. At one point, it certainly seemed like Telegram, which was and is a preferred messaging application or online space of IS and their supporters, but also a whole host of other bad actors. And they seemed like they were going to introduce their own cryptocurrency, allegedly to be called Gram, a number of years ago. This didn't occur, or this hasn't yet occurred. But nonetheless, there is a general increase in use in global populations overall in cryptocurrency use. And there are many more cryptocurrencies available now than there were even 2 to 3 years ago. And one of the things that this has resulted in is that they are much easier to use, and they are much more private. So they are increasing in privacy. The most well-known sort of privacy preserving cryptocurrency at the present time is Monero, but certainly this aspect of things is one that's changing fast, and there is increasing privacy overall. And an important factor too with regard to online extremism and terrorism is that cryptocurrency is very accessible to those who are shut out of the banking system, which is any group that has been designated as a terrorist organization, but actually a whole swathe of other actors that have been identified as engaged in extremism, for example, but also a host of other activity, as you'll be aware. So like I say again, the cryptocurrency issue is not a new one. It has been pointed to as one to watch for quite some time. But we do see an upswing in the last year or so, I would say. It is still not If you look at actual terrorist attacks, for example, crypto generally, not just currency aspects, but around this cryptocurrency issue, its use in terrorist attacks is growing, but it's still not particularly significant. But it can be expected to increase. And I guess what I've learned, and anybody who's been active in this online space over time, is that once something becomes more widely used in the general population, then that something will be more widely used in extremism and terrorism circles. And I think this is a very good example of that, crypto financing or fundraising. The fifth thing and final thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is with respect to legislation. And actually, this is something that has hugely gained in momentum in the last year or so. I talked about the EU at the outset and the EU's internet forum, the EUIF. Out of that, those discussions, which are sort of private public discussions that involve both EU member states and a bunch of major social media and other internet companies, has emerged the EU regulation on addressing the dissemination of terrorism content online, sometimes called the TICO, and that will come into full effect in June of 2022. I think the European Union is a really interesting supranational organization to look at with respect to online extremism and terrorism regulation for a number of reasons. One is that they really are first movers in this space. The TICO is a tailored piece of legislation that's going to apply in all EU member states, and it is focused on something quite specific: terrorist online content and its circulation and dissemination and what have you. But the EU is also working, and has been over the last number of years, on at least two other pieces of legislation that are likely to have significant impacts in this area also. One is the Digital Markets Act, and the other is the Digital Services Act, so the DMA and the DSA. And those are ones to watch also. And like I say, along with the TICO, really the EU are first movers in this regard. And this is important because others then have a tendency to emulate this activity potentially. The UK Online Safety Bill certainly also has resonance, and a host of other countries are also working on legislation, including Australia, including New Zealand, again, who have an interesting bill in the works around live streaming, which, like the EU regulation, is quite tailored. The Australian legislation, the UK legislation is more harms-based, so it's much wider than either the TICO or, for example, the New Zealand legislation. So there is a lot of activity in this space. And the other thing that I think it's worth drawing your attention to as regards legislation is non-Western countries. So, for example, India has quite a lot of legislation in the works, as in your own region. Just in the last number of weeks, Indonesia has announced new activity in this area. So one of the things that almost everybody active in this space will agree on is that there is a real uptick in legislative activity around online extremism and terrorism at the present time. Regulation is hot. And it's going to be interesting in order to see what happens. I guess some things will go right and some things are definitely almost certainly about to go wrong in this space, and we can come back maybe and talk about some of the pros and cons of this going forward. I guess what I would say is that I'm somebody who favors regulation. I favor regulation because that's the job of government, also because there's no reason why the online space shouldn't be regulated as opposed to all the other spaces in which we operate on a day-to-day basis. However, as Michelle alluded to at the outset, there are some real difficulties with legislating for the online, and a key difficulty is the really, really rapid pace of change in this space, but also some of the technicalities arising and what have you. So the intersections of that fastness and also, you know, the complexity of some of the technologies and what have you means that it's not straightforward to legislate in this area. And so I think there's going to be a lot of fits and starts. Unfortunately, there's going to be mistakes made, but you know, over time, one would hope we can see some kind of a regulatory regime emerging that is appropriate. My concluding thoughts. Some things I'm still mulling over, some things that I wanted to draw your attention to for the longer term. Many people will be aware that Donald Trump, in the wake of the January 6th events, was booted out of various major social media platforms, and some minor ones too. His response was to say he would set up his own social media platform. It's called Truth Social. It has had all kinds of teething problems, but it's definitely one to watch because there's no doubt that if it does eventually get off the ground, it will likely be an attractive space for extreme right users, and something for you know, anybody interested in this space in the UK and Ireland, in Australia and New Zealand, for example, is always when some new space emerges that is established in the United States, because they're English language speakers like ourselves, and so these platforms generally are also attractive to extreme right users in the UK and Ireland, in Australia and New Zealand, and other English speaking countries. And because the US has some fairly distinctly different laws on free speech and whatnot, then they generally do come into play in terms of the online extremist and also terrorist landscapes in other jurisdictions outside of the United States. Truth Social, it's one to watch. They're using a backend that's decentralized web also, so it does hark back to something I pointed to already. The other thing, of course, is the so-called metaverse that people are hearing a lot about at the present time. You know, it's unclear, I think, what precisely that may mean or what that actually refers to right now. But there is, you know, all kinds of sort of Google glasses and all other kinds of Oculus and other technology that are sort of components, if you like, of the metaverse. And so it's one to watch. You know, already some of the activity around this is concerning, just because it looks like, once again, major technology companies have released sort of tools and services that have the potential to be used by extremists and terrorists without doing a sort of 360-degree analysis and baking in protections That is, as ever, a concern. And then I guess the final thing I wanted to draw your attention to, and one that I've been mulling over, is NFTs. And this is an interesting one, purely because for anyone who has some kind of a grasp of what NFTs are, they're getting a lot of hype at the present time, and always when something is being hyped, especially amongst online users and inverted commas tech bros and the like. It's interesting to think about, okay, what if this really goes more widespread, and thereby it is being looked at and explored by extremists and terrorists, and how could they use these technologies, these online entities for their own purposes. And I guess maybe there's a financing aspect or what have you, but I'd be interested to hear anyone else's views on nefarious use of NFTs, particularly as it relates to extremism and terrorism. I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much, Maura, for that, as always, excellent presentation, and giving us so much to mull over and think about, and contemplate for the future. I know that I already have a long list of questions myself, but perhaps I might privilege it over to Michelle as the convener, who had a question first. And Michelle, I just invite you to jump on in and give the question. And if there are others who have questions, feel free to either post it in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand. I'll call upon you so you can give out ask your answer live, whichever you prefer. But first, Michelle, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lydia, and thank you so much, Maura. I have like a million questions. I'm going to restrict myself to one. Look, it's really going back to some of the very fascinating things you were saying about this move back to old tech. Yeah. Now, on one, so there are going to be two parts to this question. On one level, of course, it makes perfect sense to say that there's a kind of retro drive on old tech because of monitoring, because of takedowns and so forth. So, people, it's reactive, right? It's a reaction to the fact that the environment is becoming more challenging and saying, okay, what are other spaces that we can exploit? But I'm actually wondering if it's only that, or if it doesn't also say something, this old tech push doesn't also say something about a desire to have more targeted strategic communications. So if you think back, to what you can call the heyday of Islamic State in particular, but also Al-Qaeda at a particular point, where their strategies were very much a broadcast strategy, right? How many people can we reach, showing the power of their reach and their penetration, through really big ticket communication, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. But I'm wondering if the vibe is now different, particularly for the extreme right, where targeted, strategic, and this is also decentralized, right? So old tech fits with the kind of ideas of decentralization. So this is what was in my head. Is old tech telling us something also about the cultural moment of the extreme right, in a proactive sense, and that they are thinking differently about their strategies and who they're targeting and how they're doing that? And I would welcome your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michelle. I really like your point. I guess I would say probably both. I think it can certainly be spun as a more targeted sort of marketing campaign or what have you. We do know that violent jihadis on the one hand, and to a lesser extent extreme right users on the other hand, but nonetheless also the extreme right. They are all the time seeking to get back onto major social media platforms. I mean, this is a major gripe on the one hand, and then they have actual coordinated activity, especially so-called Islamic State users, you know, that seeks to make that happen pretty much all day, every day, right? So we know that they've lost something in terms of being very widely deplatformed. Having said that, there are, I think, there is utility in sort of more targeted approaches potentially, and definitely, like I say, there is a spin that you can put on it, on this deplatforming, which is to say we're taking a different approach now. I would say that they're being forced to take a different approach, and so you've got to make the most of what you got, right? And so from that perspective, I can definitely see how email, websites, audio, and what have you begin to look quite attractive again on the one hand, and especially for those who have been familiar with that in the past, for example. But also looking forward, other people cast their eyes around and think about future type technologies are new and emerging, and that's why we do see more DWeb activity also. So for me, I see it as, on the one hand, really, and as a core aspect of it is that it's an upshot of the really widespread deplatforming. But I think it could certainly be spun as something, if not positive, at least not entirely negative. And of course, an aspect of it is, so there's the way in which, if we talk about so-called Islamic State, for example, one of the things that they definitely knew they had lost with the massive deplatforming is a potentially huge worldwide audience. Now, their propaganda definitely didn't resonate with very large numbers of people. But if you have the capacity to reach massive numbers of people, well, then if even small numbers of those people sort of take up your ideology to a greater or lesser extent, that's a positive from Islamic State's perspective. And even if a very small number of those, you know, take a decision to, you know, act on your behalf or travel on your behalf or what have you at one point in time, well, then that's also a win, because even a vanishingly small number of people, portion of a massive crowd, right, is potentially quite significant. So that's what IS is very aware that it has lost. On the other hand, there is a way in which people, users who persist in the face of this deplatforming and to seek out and join these other online spaces that are not quite as accessible as the major social media platforms, for example, well, you could argue that those people are likely more committed, and therefore maybe the loss of numbers means that you get a gain in terms of the commitment of those who persist in these spaces, and especially those who persist, you know, because there's relatively few places where there's absolutely no intervention, absolutely no disruption, right? So those who come back again and again, they are quite devoted. And so, you know, there's a certain utility, I guess, in that. And if we think about email, for example, well, then if what you're talking about is sort of relatively small numbers of users who are, you know, connected in this way or whatnot, well, that could have a certain level of advantage from an extremism and terrorism perspective.
Thank you, Maura.